Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to get started as people are filing in. Thank you so much for joining us. I am joining you from a very warm, increasingly warm Washington, D.C. Cannot believe that it's going to be May really soon. But welcome to today's Thursday Talk. Our Thursday Talks aim to bring you the best and most innovative learning there is in the peace building field and beyond. Whether this is your first Thursday talk or you're one of our regular participants, it's really great to have you here with us today. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Communications and Learning Officer at Search for Common Ground and the Communications Lead for DME for Peace. I will be moderating today's session. So today, our discussion is focusing on all things about developmental evaluation. Developmental evaluation in the context of DM&E. And I am delighted to welcome first Sierra Frischknecht. And she wrote out her last name for me phonetically, but I probably still messed it up. But Sierra, thank you for joining us, and Lilly Crown Wilder, both members of the Developmental Evaluation Pilot Activity, or DEPA-MERL, as you might know it, which is funded by USAID. Lilly is also a Research Evaluation and Learning Officer at Search for Common Ground, and Sierra is a Senior Program Manager for Strategy, Performance, and Learning at Social Impact. Thank you both for joining us today. Just a note about how we will spend our time together. As Sierra and Lilly are presenting, you can write your question using the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. When you do that, also please try to write your name and affiliation if you are able. And also, before we begin, I'm going in your chat box, I'm going to share with you a link from our hosts. This link will take you to the project page for DEPA-MERL, and there's a lot of resources there and information that will be really helpful. It'll be work that they talk about today during the webinar, but also more. So please give it a look. You can look at it while we talk if you want to follow along, but also it's something for you to reference after the webinar today. So I'm dropping it in the chat function. There you go. All right, so with that, let me hand it over to our host to take it away. Sierra, Lilly. I don't think we can hear you. If you could check your audio. One second, everyone. Yes, Sierra, if you're talking, we cannot hear you currently. Yes, you are not muted. I'm not quite sure. Your audio was working before we started. What I would recommend, and apologies everyone, this happens, you know how technology is. What I would recommend, Sierra, is if you log out and then log back in, and we'll give that a go. In the meantime, Lilly, I don't know if, I know this is Sierra's part of the presentation, but if you have anything to add while Sierra logs out and back in, please feel free.
Can anybody hear me?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Okay, well, no idea what I did, but it was magic. Hi, everyone. This is Sierra.
Wonderful.
Sorry about the tech issues. I'm hearing noise, so hopefully it means that I'm coming through now.
You are.
Technology.
And that's life,
Great.
you know?
so let's jump in. I'm just going to get us started with a brief introduction of our team at DEPA-MERL and developmental evaluation in general. Some of you may already be familiar with DE, so we won't go into exhaustive detail. We want to get to more of the interesting content that Lilly has about how we do this in more complex environments. But so starting with DEPA-MERL, so we are the Developmental Evaluation Pilot Activity. It's funded by USAID. And we fall under the MERLIN, which is one of my favorite acronyms, in the Monitoring, Evaluation, Research, and Learning Innovations. So our role is to pilot DEs in the USAID context, and we're really trying to learn when is DE useful, when is it not useful, because it's not always the best solution, and how to do it practically. And so we're trying to capture lessons learned about DE from the work that we're doing, sometimes from the work that other people are doing, and to share that with the development community. So I'm joined by my colleague Lilly from Search for Common Ground, who's our partner on DEPA and our specialist on working in conflict environments. And our other member of our consortium is the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. And they joined the consortium as our learning partner. They help us evaluate our evaluations through outcome harvesting and other interesting approaches to really help us capture those interesting learnings. So on to kind of what is DE is a little background for those who may be newer to DE. DE was recently added on the USAID side to in the revisions for the ADS 201 is part of filling the requirements for performance evaluations for activities, and it's still new. I think it's gaining traction across the development community, perhaps in part because of the work that we're doing. But when we think about developmental evaluation, I really try to think about the implications of that word developmental. That first, the activity itself is being developed by the DE, the activity, the program, or whatever is kind of being evaluated. The goal of the DE is to lead to action and to adaptation. It's one of the most utilization focused forms of evaluation, because DEs are not meant to provide summative results, but really to inform ongoing progress. What outcomes are being realized? We've got this fun little graphic here. What emergent outcomes are coming through the results of the activity? What outcomes are not being realized? And the way that DE does this is by having an embedded evaluator works closely with the implementation team to collect data, to feed back in results in continuous loops in that collaborative process, and to inform ongoing decision making. The second implication of developmental is of the evaluation itself, that DE does not have a fixed form, which is why it's really best suited for the complex kind of situations. And Lily's going to be talking more about that in a little bit. So this means that the DE itself is also adapting, that the research questions, the approaches, the methodologies are really inherently flexible and can be revised throughout the life of the developmental evaluation to meet the best needs of the program. So the DE is really focused on learning and use rather than accountability. Sometimes the word evaluation can be off-putting and to implementers, especially when you talk about having someone be embedded in their team working alongside with them. And so we always really try to emphasize that kind of learning aspect. So here's some kind of a side-by-side over kind of what we think makes DE different from traditional evaluation. I mean, really focusing on that learning orientation, that it's methodologically flexible and rigorous, but draws on a whole host of different evaluation methodologies based on what the needs are at that time. It can also change. And that the evaluation results don't come through a single report at the end. It really is focused on smaller scale, discrete, fit for purpose deliverables that come through to the implementation team throughout their life cycle so that it can inform that ongoing adaptation. Hopefully that can expel some DE misconceptions. And again, the resources that we posted earlier on our DEPA-MERL website, we've prepared a lot of different materials about kind of the background of DE, and we encourage you to go there for more information. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lilly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today, and it's great to be speaking with you all. I am going to be talking about how DEs can be adapted in order to suit complex and fragile environments. So here we have a variety of different structures that show how DEs are very flexible and that there's a variety of ways that they can be configured, in order to fit the context, and that's based on the number and type of evaluators, the length, and other factors. So by taking an evaluation approach that is quick, ongoing, and iterative in terms of the data collection, analysis, and the feedback, timely changes are much more easily made throughout the project's life cycle. And because the deliverables of the DE itself are ongoing and they're defined by the users and evaluators regularly and iteratively, this means that the approach can change over time in order to involve more or less team members, adjust the length, or provide additional levels of surge support for technical advising. We've had a variety of different lessons learned to date about these configurations, and I'll be referencing some of those lessons which come from our Across Pilots analysis that you can find on the DEPA-MERL website. For example, we found that developmental evaluators were one of the biggest reported sources of added value in DEs in the DEPA-MERL pilots. And the intimate nature of the developmental evaluators' embeddedness allowed them to be able to share useful and timely information with stakeholders in a way that was understanding of their different needs and complexities. And compared to other evaluation approaches such as performance evaluation, respondents said that DE was better because it was more aware of complexities in the local environment. It allowed for evidence-based decision-making, it facilitated adaptations to their program, and it provided feedback in a more timely manner. And as you can see, DE supports innovative, complex programming. As you all know, funders frequently operate in rapidly changing environments that require innovation and dynamic programming. And these programs may or may not have tested theories of change or fully developed designs. And so DEs monitor how environments evolve, and they work collaboratively with the stakeholders in order to adjust the program activities and objectives in response. And as a result, what we see is that this process leads to evidence-based decision-making and facilitated adaptations to programs. Now let's talk about DE in complex environments, one specific example being the Community Memorialization Project. And we'll start by talking about why DE was a good fit for this environment. So this project started in 2015, and the DE is providing ongoing learning support for this project, which uses memory in order to support peace building and reconciliation in post-war Sri Lankan communities. And using memory as a tool for peace building is definitely a non-traditional intervention. So, there weren't a lot of established best practices and evidence. And the project team wanted an evaluation that could be embedded into CMP's design to enable this iterative adjustments and ongoing learning. In order to facilitate this, CMP included a DE to get real-time feedback on the implementation approaches. What was effective, what wasn't, and what were the differences between the initial assumptions and the actual events. The project kind of started as more of an idea than a full-fledged project with planned activities, time periods, and target groups. And so the idea was that the DE would help it evolve into what it needed, and the team would be able to adjust according to the participants' feedback. The CMP, was really looking for evaluation support to formalize their process of reflection and adjust the project going forward. Now I'll show a couple of different examples in order to talk about what complexity looks like in practice and how exactly these different DEs adapt. So here on this slide, we have 3 different examples of pilots, the CMP in Sri Lanka case that I previously mentioned, as well as 2 other DEs that needed to be conducted remotely due to the COVID-19 context. And if you want additional information about these than what I'm providing here, you can check out our case study series that's also listed on the DEPA-MERL website. So starting with this CMP example, as mentioned previously, this was a non-traditional intervention, and so doing a DE enabled the team to make iterative updates to their workshop design. They could discard elements of the original design that no longer resonated, and then they could also think towards the future and design the project's second phase with a focus more on dialogue. And then secondly, we have this Boresha Afya Tanzania case, which was a DE conducted between 2017 and 2021 to help USAID generate real-time evidence and support adaptive management practices in order to improve integrated health services across Tanzania. And the complexity of the project was definitely well suited to DE. It had an undefined theory of change, and the outcomes were quite difficult to predict and measure due to the nature of the project as well as the partners. And so the DE processes allowed for real-time generation of evidence and the catalyzation of rapid learning and decision-making. And as a result of these learnings, the team was able to develop new strategies in order to promote male engagement in prenatal care services that were offered to women. They also offered on-site recommendations during site visits that led to better functioning facilitation in clinics. And then finally, in the Jalan Indonesia example, between 2018 and 2022, the Jalan project in Indonesia supported the Indonesian Ministry of Health and DAI in their work to reduce maternal and neonatal mortality from preventable death through co-created and local solutions. This project was developed in response to a worrying rise in maternal deaths. And so the idea was that Jalan piloted and tested a wide variety of different innovative interventions in order to test their efficacy. And then they scaled them based on what supporting evidence they could gather. It was definitely a very adaptive management structure. In this case, the DE was held over a series of 18 smaller individual meetings as opposed to the acculturation workshop. And the Jalan team was able to engage a diverse array of stakeholders in order to identify 71 different solutions that could potentially improve maternal and neonatal health outcomes. And the DE ended up producing infographics, online maps, and other online tools that helped USAID staff quickly understand what Jalan's challenges were, the value of these different interventions, and then make informed management decisions about how exactly they wanted to adapt the project. So continuing on this theme of sort of remote management, I would like to pull a couple of highlights from our virtual best practices. So firstly, what are some of the challenges that we've seen conducting virtual DEs? So these sort of categories that you see here, embeddedness, trust, engagement, data collection, deliverables, and learning products, these are all challenges that are quite typical across DEs in general. However, considering that traditional DE relies on the evaluator or evaluators being embedded physically within the program teams, and then using that physical presence in order to build trust, communication, access to information, identify opportunities to support, this made remote DEs exceptionally challenging. Yet still, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic forced an unprecedented global shift to remote work. And DE implementers continued to do what they do best, which is adapt and innovate. And so we were able to face the challenges of continuing remotely. So while evaluators must remain independent, they must also integrate enough in order to easily access a team's processes, their formal and informal data, and the decision makers. And so in the initial embedding, evaluators seek to access documents, join team meetings and communications, and begin other observations and data collection. Face-to-face interaction definitely accelerates this embedding and trust building. And of course, the evaluator benefits from close interaction with the teams in order to guide this reflection and adaptation process and monitor the progress of any changes. So that being said, evaluators who have been forced to transition to remote work must adjust their approach to compensate for the lack of in-person engagement so that the limitations don't ripple throughout the rest of the DE, as limited collaboration and connection makes it difficult to facilitate this reflection and adaptation. Here's the solutions. So now for some of the steps that evaluators took to overcome the challenges that they were facing. So firstly, in terms of embeddedness, in order to facilitate this sort of behavioral embeddedness and integration of the evaluator with teams and people, one solution was a push to include evaluators in as many remote interactions as possible with champions who can quickly incorporate the evaluator at every opportunity. And in order to build trust remotely and maintain awareness of DE in a remote environment, evaluators can produce a high volume of intentional and creative communications. One evaluator, for example, shared about how she always shows up early and stays late to meetings so that then there can be more room for kind of informal chit chat. And it's a way to create this intentional but not uncomfortable moments for information sharing during downtime. And as DE requires high level of engagement, building very strong communication structures is essential for remote DEs. All of the evaluators who we interviewed overcame these challenges through intentional efforts to seek out informal conversations, use creative communication and presentation platforms, and explain the DE and their role upfront and succinctly. For example, one evaluator used platforms like Google Slides and Mural in order to increase collaboration and participation, facilitate brainstorming and strategic planning. Social media was also useful for other stakeholder reflection sessions as we were transitioning remotely. Steady information flow definitely also informs the ongoing adaptation that has to occur in effective DEs. So the biggest data collection challenges that evaluators named definitely apply to any type of remote evaluation. They were lack of oversight for quality assurance and time delays. Time delays are definitely a common challenge I'm sure we've all faced. Some evaluators, in order to respond to this, tried to allow local partners to submit photos through WhatsApp instead of needing to do in-person site visits. And others increased the volume of data collection events in order to get perspectives from a broader pool. The most effective solutions to this problem, though, are definitely building flexibility into work plans and establishing quality control systems that are supplemented by capacity building. So finally, in terms of deliverables and learning products, DEs tend to deliver intermittent, shorter form deliverables rather than a long form traditional evaluation report. And these are that's often developed with higher levels of stakeholder input. Some remote DEs offered shorter, visual, and innovative products in order to help their clients monitor the progress of the work throughout by preparing infographics, online maps, and videos. Others reduce their scope to really narrow in on and focus on the most relevant and critical topics. So in general, increasing communication seems to be the most effective way to guide the change process here. And if you would like to learn more about these remote DEs, Jen has put into the chat a link to the resource where you can find more information about this. So thank you, and I'll now pass it back to Sierra.
Great. Please say that people can hear me.
Yes, yes.
Great. I'm just going to take a few minutes before we open it up for Q&A to kind of get to the nuts and bolts about how you make a DE happen. I mean, we really wanted to make this the most interesting and practical to all of you. And so these next couple of slides draw on our guide for DE funders and guide for DE implementers. Both of those are linked on the DEPA-MERL website and provide kind of a step-by-step with a lot of resources on, if you're interested in doing DE, how you can make that happen. I'm just going to touch on a few of the highlights. I mean, starting with fit. I mean, DE can be a very valuable tool, but it's not always the best fit, and it's not the best fit for every activity. It's time and resource intensive, and it's not accountability focused. It's really focused on that learning and use piece. And so here's a list of some questions that you might want to consider if you're thinking about DE. And really at the high level, if it's a more complex environment, it is really the best value for DE when you have that mixture of realized or unrealized or potentially emergent outcomes, or when you need support because you know that your activity or your environment is going to necessitate ongoing changes, because DE really focuses on adaptation. Another set of readiness criteria is thinking about, do you have the right structure for it? Do you have flexibility in your implementation or in your timelines to be able to adapt in response to information that's coming in from the DE? That flexibility in a procurement mechanism or contracting can be very, very important. And then also thinking about, is there a structure in which you can have an evaluator be embedded? some of these questions, this is kind of the very base level, just is it even worth considering DE? Because I think these are some of the more critical pieces. You don't need to have all of them, but certainly having a couple of them is going to make DE more valuable. Then we think about scoping. If you think that DE could be a good fit for your activity, how do you scope something that is supposed to be constantly evolving? And so we've tried to highlight a few areas you want to be thinking about to really hone in on what is going to be the purpose of DE and how can it bring value to your activity. I think the very first column about, how do you identify key decisions is really important, because DE works best when it's not focused on, at least in the scoping phase, when you're not focused on the specific tasks. The evaluator is going to do this and this and this and this. That's just not as useful. You really want to think about what are the decisions that need to be made, what are the opportunities for adaptation, and then backtrack to how can the DE inform those? How can it get the information you need? How can it feed into those decision makings? And so because of that, DE takes time. You're embedding an evaluator, you're building trust, and you're feeding in data on an iterative cycle. So we usually recommend 6 months to a year, and at minimum. I think often we see multi-year DEs that follow the full implementation period can also be really valuable, but that has budget implications. So the third. So when you're working with embedded evaluators on a more intensive collaborative model, then the budget range can be wide. It really depends on the team structure. So that's something to think about in your scope is what is your budget available? How does that relate to the timeline of what you can commit to a DE? And is that going to meet your needs? And then the last couple of ones really are focused on that adaptation. Are there opportunities to adapt? Does the implementation structure allow it? And is the team that you're working with, and often that's the funder as well as the implementer, is it ready for DE and in a place where it can accept and really work collaboratively with an evaluator or with a team of evaluators? There's nothing more frustrating than knowing that a change should be made and that there's data to support it, but then not having either the mechanism to be able to make those changes or the support within the organization. So those are things to think about before you then transition to how do you turn that into a scope of work. I mean, I would recommend, again, going to our DE guides. There are templates on a draft scope of work there that you can draw from. We try to hit some of the highlights here of what we recommend, but really when you get to drafting a scope of work, you want to be focusing on the structure of the DE, striking a balance between what do you know about the structure and what resources do you need with the level of specificity. And that kind of goes back to thinking about not just what are the tasks that are going to be done, but what are the decisions to be made can be more useful to put into a draft scope of work. And so that the scope has enough flexibility that the DE can also adapt as it's supporting the activity throughout its adaptation process. I think that as you're building out a scope of work, there may be milestones you want to put in. We've recommended some phases, maybe a pre-DE phase as you're doing more scoping, an acculturation phase where you're orienting the team and other stakeholders to what the DE is, really focusing on that learning. Implementation, there may be multiple phases of implementation focused on different sets of learning questions, and to have milestones built within there where the scope of the DE and the direction it's going can be revisited. We will pause there on the kind of the practical tips, but again, please follow up with us and reference our guides if you have more questions. You have our contact information here. And I'm happy to turn it over to the audience for any questions.
Thanks so much, Sierra and Lily. That was really great. You packed a lot into just a brief amount of time, and we appreciate it. So now let's get to the Q&A portion of our webinar. Just letting you know that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be placed on the DM&E for Peace site. So now, a couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks. You can submit a question or comment in two ways. The first is through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live yourself. When you submit your question for us, as I mentioned before, it'd be great if you could submit your name and affiliation. We understand if not, but we always recommend that just so I can attribute it to you. And just to note, these talks are recorded. Oh, I already said that, so good to go. But yes, these talks are recorded. So we already have a few questions that have been sent in, and they're really great. And I'm going to start off with this first one from Nathan Morrow. And as I present these current questions, I encourage you all to be sending in your questions or raising your hands. So Nathan Morrow asks, it's about DE capacity. So Nathan says, there does not seem to be a large number of people trained in DE or with DE experience. So should people without any DE experience attempt DE? And then in this case, Nathan references attempt DE on a USAID project specifically.
Nathan, I think that's a great question, and Lily, please feel free to jump in. And it's exactly right, because DE is new. There are not many people that can say I've done developmental evaluation or I'm a developmental evaluator. We think more about what are the core skill sets that you need, both on the evaluator side as well as on the management of the DE side. And we found a lot of just experienced evaluators, or especially people more attuned to the adaptive management space, can adapt quite well to implementing a developmental evaluation. So the short answer is yes. I think that you can still undertake a DE if you haven't done it before, because it's still a new field for everyone. So I don't think that there's really very many people or organizations that can be named as experts. There are probably a few, but in that space, I think it's really looking more for those readiness criteria, the willingness to collaborate both on the part of the evaluator as well as the implementer, and then looking for skill sets of someone who can build trust within an organization is really important, to have an evaluator that can quickly establish themselves as part of the team, to generate quick wins. So we're often looking for someone that has flexibility in the types of approaches they can use, that are versed in whether it's qualitative or quantitative, or a mixture of both, in being able to pull in a diverse set of skills into it. And that ability to kind of keep track of all of the moving pieces of the work and that's often what are the learning questions that we're working towards, what are the decisions that are being made, and how can we feed into those. So someone who is quite well organized and can be really responsive to the implementation team is someone who has the right base skill sets for an evaluator, and can be matched with some overarching guidance, which is why we also recommend having kind of some support from an administrator to help keep everything on focus. And I've said this a lot, but I think our guides also provide some insight in how to select an evaluator and how to see if your team is also ready to implement a DE.
Yeah, thanks, Sierra. That I just have a bit to add, and I completely agree that I think it's not necessarily about the technical skill set that you have, and if you've performed DEs before, but more of kind of on the professional competency side, and sort of how much of an analytical thinker they are. Definitely these communication practices that Sierra mentioned, they have to be very proactive and able to jump into a complex environment where deliverables are changing, and be able to sort of make sense of it and get people on track. And so I think that probably does require a certain type of person. Maybe they don't, because it can be adapted in a variety of ways, the DE itself, and there's not a set methodology that needs to be used, or a set set tools, I think that it makes it so that the person doing it, or persons, it could also be a team. I think that definitely creates some wiggle room and sort of room for experimentation. And it's also definitely, as Sierra mentioned, about the context that they're going into and making sure that that's a good fit, and that, there's willingness for adaptation, and, all of the different sort of readiness factors that we were mentioning earlier.
Great, thank you for that. As a bit of a follow-up, Nancy Mock says, while I agree with the analysis, we risk sacrificing sufficient evidence quality. No, so that's a question, like, is that a risk? Sacrificing sufficient evidence quality. DE evaluators do DE evaluators need a toolkit of methods? Any follow-up with that?
Yes, certainly plenty. I think that the only cases where you're sacrificing quality is where your evaluator is sacrificing quality. I think it's more about what is the goal of data collection, and the purpose of the evaluation for learning versus accountability. I don't think there's anything that necessarily sacrifices quality by kind of the DE approach, which can still hold to really high standards of rigor in data collection. It's just simply that the data is often packaged differently. It's not several months of data collection that are feeding into a single deliverable, but smaller scale ongoing data collection and observation, because the evaluator is embedded within the team, and that is packaged differently. So we find that at a developmental evaluation, it's not as much a report. It might be an options memo. It might be a training or a reflections presentation or a session that can still hold to high standards of rigor, but are serving a different function than other forms of evaluation. There was a second part to that question that I'm afraid has escaped me. Could you read it
No,
again
it's
one more
fine.
time?
Yeah, no, it has to do with having a toolkit of methods. If that, is that needed, or is that something that should be needed? Especially, I think when somebody's new to doing DE work.
And I think that's a great idea as well. The methods that are going to be used depend on the questions and the timeline, and so we would want any evaluator, and even in that scoping process, to start to think about what are going to be some of those initial steps, and what are going to be the right methods. So at DEPA, we do have kind of a toolkit of methods that we would recommend. It's important to have kind of quick wins, especially in those initial periods. We'll often start with kind of an acculturation workshop to get everyone on board with the DE, and then build out from there into what are going to be the initial learning opportunities. So I agree that a toolkit can be really valuable. Often our evaluators come with their own preferred methods or base competencies, and then we'll often supplement that with methods, or even with surge support in certain areas, because you can't always find a unicorn of an evaluator that can do everything. And so in DEPA, part of the reason we also have our consortium support is that the evaluator will lead in the areas where they have strong competencies, and we can draw on other members of our team to provide surge support in other method areas that might not be as much their strength, or why we're still building out those additional skill sets.
Great, thank you so much. So moving on, I have a question from Chelsea Kuhn. Sorry. So this deals more with doing DE in conflict zones. So Chelsea says, it seems like the cases that you've showcased here for complex environment examples are in situations where the contexts have fewer active conflict zones and are moving along on the peace building journey, headed in that direction already. And are there cases or specific practices to focus on when using DEs in active conflict zones and less/non-permissive environments?
Great question. I think Lily's having some tech issues, but I'll also toss it over to Lily if you're available. But if not, I'm happy to jump in. Okay, well, I'll do my best to respond. One of the surprising things to us at DEPA over the 5 or 6+ years that we've been working on DE is I think we expected there to be a lot more demand for DE in conflict zones than what we've seen in the initial pilots, and which is why you see in a lot of our case studies, we do have some that are working in complex environments, but not in conflict environments per se, which really is where the DE has an opportunity to shine, but it is not something that we've piloted as much. I think in a conflict environment, you obviously have many of the same constraints on implementation you would have for a regular evaluation, perhaps more so when you're working over a longer period of time and have an embedded team member. So I'll just say that I don't think I have a pure answer for this yet, because I think this is something that we are hoping to collect more evidence on in having more DEs take place in conflict environments. I think at its base, and why DE is a good fit for that space, is because of its ability to adapt to complexity. And we have framed this more in focusing on the complexity side than on the conflict side. But having evaluators that also have that basis in conflict programming as well is going to be an important additional skill set in a conflict environment. And then being able to have a data collection mechanism and kind of that reflection and learning cycle process that's integral to a DE align with the ongoing adaptation process within conflict-oriented programming. So stay tuned. I think this is an area that we're, as I said, hoping to continue to explore, and would be open to other people sharing their experiences as well, because it is, I think, a continued gap in some of the evidence base that we're building around DE.
Great, thank you. If anyone's wondering, Lily has logged out and she's going to log back in, but that's where the presentation slide has gone, just because she's having some audio issues. So I'm going to combine 2 questions here that deal with kind of doing DE in relation to how it compares to other methods. So one of the questions is, what is the difference between regular internal M&E and DE? And then also, just to piggyback on that, how does DE connect with other evaluative approaches, such as RTEs and rapid reviews?
RTEs, I'm racking my brain here for RTEs a little bit, but on
yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. No, sorry. It's rapid evaluating.
Rapid evaluations. Okay, great. And then on the first question about how does DE compare to regular M&E, this is such a good question, because I feel like that one of the pieces that we often have to do kind of myth busting around in DE is that your evaluator is not going to replace your traditional M&E processes. It is supplemental to the monitoring systems. The evaluator is real-time evaluations. Thank you. The evaluator is going to pull from existing monitoring data, just as kind of any other learning-oriented process would within an activity, but also supplement that with that kind of fit for purpose as needed data collection that's really directed at specific learning questions. I mean, monitoring can serve a very different purpose. It's not that monitoring doesn't align with DE, because it certainly can, but it is not the same thing. And we find that when activities or programs have tried to combine those, that there's simply not enough bandwidth to both cover the spectrum of core base monitoring and evaluation work, though I think DE does fill a large part, if not all of that evaluation part of it, but then also do the supplemental work of the developmental evaluation, where you're collecting additional data, you're feeding it back in that adaptive management cycle, and you're trying to really be very deliberate about informing changes in programming and ongoing decision making. How does it differ from kind of real-time evaluations and rapid learning cycles? I think they have a lot of similarities. I think some of the higher pieces are, DEs are long-term. We recommend a minimum of a year. Having that embedded evaluator that is independent from the team, but also working extensively with the team, is a fine line. And the evaluator maintaining a level of objectivity while also being invested in the success and the ongoing implementation of the activity can be a challenging balance to have. I think real-time evaluation is probably one of the closest comparable approaches to DE, and they all do fit within that umbrella of kind of evaluation approaches that really focuses on getting data in time to be able to feed into decision making, with some of those unique differences.
In response to thinking about time in DE, Charles Guidanet, and my apologies, I'm sure I said your last name wrong, but Charles says, in my experience with DE, it is that timely analysis and reporting is often preferred over waiting until more or better data is available. Would you second that, Sierra and Lily?
Yes, absolutely. It's about feeding back regular information, and you never want to be sitting on something that could be used for decision making. So evaluators are collecting and sharing data constantly in very different formats than you would in a traditional evaluation.
Great. And I want to point out, we are over our 45-minute limit. I'm going to keep going because we have some great questions here. I understand if you all have to leave us, but I do encourage you to stay on if you are able. So kind of thinking along the time and DE question is the issue of budgeting. So we have Domar from SFCG, so Search Indonesia, asking or commenting, I wonder how can the budgeting process of a program use DE? Damar says, I imagine it is not an easy process. As I understand, we might have a kind of evolving budget due to the evolving evaluation.
Great. I want to make sure I understand that question. So you said, how can the budgeting process involve DE, or how is it budgeting for DE, recognizing that DE evolves?
Right. So I think more along the second part. So yes, budgeting, but for DE, but how to budget knowing that the evaluation will evolve. So is there an evolving budget, or yes,
Right.
what would be your recommendations?
Right, but budgeting for DE is hard because there are so many pieces. I'm thinking back to the slide that Lily shared about kind of all of the different ways that DE can be structured, of how big the team is, and remote versus in person versus internal versus external. There's just a lot of facets about how to put kind of a DE team together. We do have a module on budgeting for DE within our implementers guide, and so recommend looking there. It gives some tips about different budget considerations. We find it works best to first invest a small portion in a scoping exercise to see what is the right length of time for the DE, the right level of evaluator, and for that, I didn't speak to this earlier, but I think it's actually quite important that when you're putting a lot of responsibility within this embedded evaluator, or sometimes multiple evaluators, because there are teams of DE, it needs to be someone who both has the right skill set, the right kind of professional competencies, but also someone who can speak to authority in a way that they can help make change happen. And in some contexts, that might need to be a more senior person who comes with a certain background or set of experience. In other cases, it might just be someone who has the right skill set for data collection and presenting data. And so that is a lot of the cost is driven by the nature of the evaluator. And so that's an important spot to start in budgeting. And then the timeline. We find it works best when you have a vision, have a profile of who that evaluator or set of evaluators will be, then and a sense of the timeline for decision making. You want to make sure the DE is going to be there for a long enough time that it can influence that decision making, and then use that as the base. Perhaps giving a little bit of a buffer, and some of the differences that we'll show in the budgeting module are, what is it going to take to embed that person? What other technology or other costs might you have that will feed into that budget? And then what we've seen is setting it for a longer time frame so that you have an opportunity, if needed, to extend the DE if perhaps there are additional funds at the end. Once you have that kind of larger budget figure. So we know, say, hey, we know we have X amount of funding that can get us through X number of months or X number of years. And then as you get to that point, being able to kind of reassess whether that did in fact meet the budget needs based on what the DE ended up doing, any additional surge support or kind of supplemental expertise that was brought in. And sometimes we find they're able to say, well, we have extra funding and we can extend the DE for another 3 months or 6 months based on that, and that's going to be useful. And other times it's kind of right on target. So it's not an easy process, but I think there are some tips in the guide there about what are the different facets of budgeting that you want to think about so that you can have a kind of a figure and a timeline that you're comfortable with.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, Lily isn't able to fix her audio issues. So Sierra, I appreciate so much. Damar says thank you as well for your answer. I have 2 questions from Lloyd Cossey, so I will give those to you quickly. Keep staying aware of our time. Lloyd asks, first, does DE also use OECD DAC criteria? And then the second question is, how pragmatic is it for an evaluator who is part of the implementation team to remain independent and objective? Sorry, they're a bit, they're not really related, but I wanted to give you both of them.
That's okay. So we can talk about the DAC criteria. I think that is very case dependent on, because a DE is not focused on kind of accountability. It's not necessarily looking at the same set of questions, relevance, coherence, efficiency, impact and sustainability. It's really focused on what are going to be the learning questions at the time, and the questions will evolve throughout the DE. You may start with a certain set of questions and saying, we know that we have this new program or this new activity. We know that it's new, and so we're going to want to be looking to make adaptations over the next 3 to 6 months. So the evaluator is going to be focused on those sorts of questions more than the evaluation criteria. However, if the implementer or the donor really wants those criteria to be major drivers of the activities, then absolutely they can be built into there. We find there's kind of mixed demand, especially within the USAID context, which is where DEPA has been working a lot for kind of applying those criteria across all evaluations. The second question was on,
yes.
Thank you.
No, it's fine. How important is it for the evaluator who was part of the original implementation team to remain independent and objective?
Yes, great question on independence. I think it is important for them to maintain some independence because I think part of the value add of having the evaluator is to bring some objectivity into collecting data, bringing that data, presenting options, and then using that to inform decision making. It is not always easy to do, and I mentioned earlier that I think one of the ways we've been successful in doing this in the pilots that we've worked on is that you don't just leave the evaluator by themselves, that it can be helpful to have we call them kind of DE administrators, a support team that it will be checking in with the evaluator, helping to monitor and manage and provide support during the process. And sometimes the role of that support team is to help the evaluator take a step back from some of the day-to-day, so that as they're getting embedded, they're also maintaining some distance in their recommendations and can maintain that somewhat objective lens. The goal is not for the evaluator to just be a supplement to the the M&E team, but to stay focused on their scope, on those higher level learning priorities and decision questions that will evolve, but should still be a guiding scope as the DE goes on.
Great, thank you. So I'll get to a few rapid fire questions. Sorry, we just have so many great ones coming in. And so we'll just take like 2 more minutes on this. So we do have, and yes, I will also, the questions that we don't get to, I just want to say that I will contact you all, and Nancy, I will contact you as well. So you will, so we can make sure that I'll put you in touch with Sierra and Lily, all of you. And if you have your remaining questions, I'll make sure they get them, and hopefully we can have them answered for you. So the last bit that I'm going to wrap up with is there a specific template for DE, or is it possible to adapt DE characteristics into evaluations to start out with instead of going fully into DE from the very start? And the other question that's not really related, but I want to get 2 more in before we wrap up. So Laura McGrew just wanted to ask the flip side of that question on budgeting is Laura said that could we have some of your thoughts related to funding changes of the program because of the DE, not funding DE specifically? Laura said that they would be interested in hearing about that. So again, the first question was about a specific template.
I wrote them down.
Right, wonderful. Fantastic, great. And yes, I will I will drop your contact information. I will drop the contact information of Lily and Sierra also into the chat for everyone.
Okay, so I had one question on kind of building DE characteristics into evaluations to start with. I think that's a really, really interesting idea. I have not seen that happen, and I'm thinking about some of the barriers to that, though I'm not going to say it can't happen. Just that it takes time to build in an evaluator and to establish. It's just really important for the evaluator to have that relationship of trust and to become embedded into the team, because a lot of what a developmental evaluator does is not formal data collection in the way we'd think about it. Though certainly they can and will do that, but there's also an ongoing observation and kind of informal data collection process, being part of the conversations, seeing communications go around. That's what takes time on the evaluation, on the embedding side. And so I'm just thinking about could be hard to first to build up that kind of level of trust so that an evaluator is able to inform that, and then to transition into a more traditional style of evaluation. I think another potential barrier is that when people hear that you're going to have an evaluator embedded across your team, it's not often a great response. And so it takes time to culturize, I don't know if that's really a word, the team to what is the function of the evaluator, and to help everyone be comfortable with the evaluator's role as informing that decision making. So again, if you were to then transition that into a more traditional style of evaluation, you just want to make sure that everyone is comfortable with what that process is going to look like, and that it really does support kind of the goal of DE, which is to be use oriented. So interesting thought experiment. I'd be interested to see that happening quick. It's 9 o'clock. The flip side of budgeting, funding changes of the program because of the DE. I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but what came to mind for me is how the results from the DE, kind of ongoing information, can inform, as it's informing adaptations to the program, the budget may be part of that. And we have seen that, as well as kind of on the implementing side, how the program or activity is implemented, and it can affect funding kind of as a part of that. You do want to think about funding for a DE and in kind of building out the structure of the program. And I think thinking about, like, in the adaptations that are possible, whether budget is part of that, whether the DE will have even the opportunity to inform kind of future funding decisions or funding for particular branches or streams of activities because of the results of the DE. I'm happy to follow up more on that. Sorry, I'm time aware, but I'm going to leave it there. And it looks like that my contact information and Lily's are both in the chat. So please feel free to follow up with us directly with more questions.
Yes, thank you so much. And since we are over time and then at the hour, I'm just going to wrap up here. I would like to say thank you, Sierra and Lily, especially Sierra, you're a champion. And just to note, everyone whose question we didn't get to, I will make sure that Sierra and Lily get it, and also you now have their contact information. So just to let you know, again, we will be sharing the presentation slides and also this recording for everyone who is here today and those also that could not join us. So I am now going to share the DEPA-MERL link once again. It's going to be dropped in your chat, where you can find tools, guides, case studies, and more on both the project and developmental evaluation as a whole. So dropped it once again for you. And additionally, here is the link to the guide on remote DE that you will not find in the first link. So if you're interested in that, I have put that link also in the chat. So I will also put these links with the recording. So everything should be there on one page on our website. You can find the recording and these links under the M&E Thursday Talk section on the website, and that should be up by the end of this week at the latest. So please check back, and then you can share it with your colleagues and return to it anytime you'd like. And we encourage you to continue the discussion under the recording in the comments section. Also, I know we are quickly wrapping up, but since I have you here today, if you haven't heard, DME for Peace is going through a redevelopment. We would love your opinions. If you're here today, you obviously, are enjoying us on some level. So I am sharing the link to our quick and easy survey that helps us, find out what we're doing right and where we have room for improvement, which we know there's always room for improvement. So if you're interested, the survey that will help us redevelop is now dropped into your chat box as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. Especially thank you, Lily and Sierra. I appreciate it so much. So that's it for us today. We will be back next Thursday with Peace Direct. We will be diving deep into their new report, Escaping Perpetual Beginnings, Challenges and Opportunities for Local Atrocity Prevention in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with author Megan Renoir. And the registration page will go up on the DME for Peace website later today. And we will also send out the link through email and social media. So keep an eye out for that. Well, finally, that's it from me. Thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, DME.